The heiress saw the janitor staring at her mother's portrait as if the woman in oil might lift her painted hand and speak. Jimena's heel paused on the marble steps of the music room, the sudden silence like a held breath. The portrait hung above the grand piano, Doña Josefa in a dress of powder blue silk, a steady, compassionate face that had watched the Montiel house for decades. Dust lay like a soft film along the gilt frame. The janitor's fingers traced the air inches from the painted rosary. Her eyes were wet and distant, and a rosary, beads darker than old wood, moved slowly through those fingers, as if mapping a prayer. Jimena straightened her shoulders to the posture the world expected of an heiress, composed, efficient, the woman who turned family grief into protocol and press statements. But for a single heartbeat, she felt the odd, primitive intrusion of something that was not yet named. Unease, maybe? Or the peculiar recognition that the house, this vast ceremonial thing she navigated like an actress, could hide corners she had never bothered to look into. "Dolores," she said, voice precise enough to halt a clock. The janitor looked up as if startled out of a reverie. Her apron was plain, frayed at the hem. The scent of lemon cleaner and hospital disinfectant clung to her. There were lines at the corner of her eyes that suggested laughter and hardship in equal measure. When she spoke, her voice was low and careful, like a hand closing on a fragile object. "She was with me," Dolores said. Not gone, Señora." The room inhaled with Jimena. Her first response was automatic, practiced, a soft smile, the tiny deflection that puts an errand in place of an argument. "We had a service. The family," she pointed, not cruelly, to the photograph album on the piano where programs from the memorial lay like neat, flat birds. "We all said goodbye." Dolores's fingers continued to move over the rosary. "I said goodbye as well," she replied, "but I also saw Doña Josefa at Santa Lucia last spring. I cleaned the ward. I sat with her. She held my hand and prayed. The janitor swallowed, searching for steadiness. She sang a hymn as if she had been waiting for something. Any rational thread in the Montiel household would have been strong enough to refute such a claim. The funeral invitations, the condolence letters, the receipt from the cemetery, the solemn photograph of Josefa in repose that had been reproduced and framed at every family gathering that first winter. But the house thrummed not with evidence, but with economy. Stories bought and ordered so no one had to linger on unmanageable sorrow. Jimena recognized that economy better than anyone. Her father's obituary had been turned into a foundation. Her mother's death had been folded into afternoon teas and press releases. Even grief at the Montiel estate had become ledgered. Dolores did not appear to be a woman prone to melodrama. There was no theatrics in the way she allowed herself to be seen standing before the portrait. Her hands, weathered, small, were evidence enough that she had scrubbed rooms and made beds in places where the world preferred not to look. The sight of her, softly upright, placed an old, useless ache behind Jimena's breast. It was not a new pain. It was the old, patient ache of nights when she had closed the door on her mother's mood swings, telling herself that the demands were a private family matter, telling herself she had done what she must. When Dolores pronounced the name of the clinic, a small sound escaped from the piano, a low, uncertain chord where a song should have been. Jimena's smile tightened. "You're saying someone pretended she was dead?" Jimena asked, and even the question was an instrument of dismissal. She was skilled in the art of denying things until they stopped existing. Dolores met her without flinching. "I am saying I saw her alive. I am saying she still wears the rosary when she prays. I am saying she remembers the rosary and she remembers the piano. She asked once, she asked if the house still had the piano tuned." Her mouth curved at the edge of something like reproach. They told her different. The word different struck the room like an off note. Jimena, quick to 1,000 different defenses, pulled herself back into the official story. The season of illness, the deterioration, the decision to place Doña Josefa where she could be cared for. Dr. Ernesto Villalobos' name hovered in the air. Consultations, reports. It was a story told in hushed, professional tones. It was neat. It had a signature. Hector arrived later, drawn by the echo of the conversation. He had been away at the factory until the early afternoon, the business that kept the family's fortune steady and its public face solid. He had not attended every meeting about his mother's care. In the months before she died, he had been a man measured by obligations and the quiet numbing of guilt. There were nights he woke wondering whether he had been gentle enough, whether he had said the things a son should say before doors closed forever. That guilt had been its own kind of religion. When he saw Dolores at the portrait, the rosary in her hand, something in Hector unclenched and then re-knotted with the same sudden, painful force. He remembered a funeral that moved like a well-rehearsed procession. The pallbearers, the cemetery gate that closed on a casket, his own hand hovering uselessly over the program. He remembered how quickly things had been organized, how quickly signatures had been gathered, how quickly the house had swapped certain pictures for the business of updating press statements. He had not questioned the pace. He had leaned on Jimena's certainty as one might lean on a wall, because the wall held. Dolores's eyes were clear. She spoke without spectacle. "I kept this," she said, and turned her palm to reveal the rosary. It was older than any heirloom in the house, its beads rubbed smooth by generations of fingers. A small silver crucifix, gulled by years, hung from it. Hector's throat closed. The rosary could have belonged to half the women he had known. But when Dolores said the name Doña Josefa, Hector felt the rosary's familiarity like an incision. He had seen that rosary in family photographs, on his mother's dresser, in the lap of Doña Josefa on Sunday afternoons, tucked under the pages of a hymnal. It was, in its small way, a fingerprint. "Where did you get it?" Hector asked, a pensioner's politeness in his voice. Beneath it, something sharp and accusing. Dolores's expression softened as if she regretted the very necessity of answering. "She gave it to me to hold for a while," she said. "She said to me, 'Keep it safe, Niña. Promise me you will keep it safe.' I promised, and I kept it. When they told me she had gone, I asked." Her fingers tightened around the beads. "They told me she had gone to a better place." The name Santa Lucia felt like a cord suddenly plucked. Hector had not heard it before. He tried to imagine a place with that name. White-clad angels, a small chapel, a place where sick people received attention. But the way Dolores said it, tone flat, unromantic, made the name seem plain and domestic. It was neither saint nor altar, but a facility that kept its doors closed. Jimena's impatience finally unlatched itself like a key. "This is absurd," she said. "We had a funeral. The public records. He's—" She caught herself and carefully folded the sentence into the company architecture. "There are documents. You are—" She looked at Dolores with an expression that was both pitying and impermeable. "You would not have had access to her files." Dolores looked at Jimena with the small, imperturbable dignity of someone who had spent her life in service but refused to be dismissed. "People talk. Nurses, cleaners. There are always voices. I heard hers." She placed the rosary on the piano and, as if not wanting to challenge the room too directly, she asked about her picture. At the mention of the portrait, Hector's chest constricted. He slid a hand along the piano's lacquered edge and felt the groove of wear where his mother had once leaned on her elbows to listen to a student practicing scales. Memory does strange things. It gelled moments into one another, so that the present was always haunted by the echo of the past. He remembered his mother's hands, often still, but never empty. He remembered a lullaby she used to sing when a storm came over the city and the rain pressed like an accusation against the windows. In the weeks that followed, the household sighed and readjusted. Dolores continued her work with the quiet confidence of someone who had decided to name a thing. She washed floors, emptied trash, and yet beneath those ordinary motions lay a deliberate, almost brittle purpose. She would catch Hector alone sometimes and press the rosary into his hand, the beads warm from the friction of her palms. "Keep it," she would say. "If you want to know if she's really gone, you have to listen." Hector listened because he did not trust himself not to. At nights, he returned to the quiet of his study and opened drawers he had not thought about in years. The Montiel house was a cabinet of records, letters, social registers, contracts, mundane objects that charted the family's lineage and its choices. He had not wanted to find anything accusing, yet the human tendency to hide things often left a trail the cautious might ignore but never entirely erase. He discovered small things first: a receipt folded in the back of an old album, the remnant of an envelope with a clinic stamp barely legible, a name in an accounting ledger that tasted wrong next to other family expenses. The handwriting on the receipts had the same confident sweep he had seen on foundation checks. Jimena's signature was neat and practiced, the sort of signature used to authorize mind shifts of money. The accounts office had been efficient, a vault of decisions. Money moved as expected. Insurance clauses, consultant fees, the kinds of transfers that in big houses are discussed without malice and with the rigid economy of habit. But the transfers were frequent and oddly large for something labeled "transfer to care." There were dates that overlapped with days the family had held events with Doña Josefa's portrait prominently displayed in the receiving room. Hector felt the ground shift not because he wanted to, but because the facts had a gravity of their own. He understood, in a way he had not allowed himself to, that the house's order had been preserved at a cost, and the cost might be more than he had bargained to pay. Dolores's story did not fit the neat categories he had used to rationalize his guilt. She did not stand in the doorway demanding punishment. She offered instead an artifact and a series of small, painful memories. The way Doña Josefa set her cup down, the timbre of a hymn she hummed under her breath, the way she insisted on touching the rosary before falling to sleep. These were not the details of a conspiracy so much as the messy, human accessories of a life that had been filed away. On an evening when rain came like a curtain across the estate, Hector sat at his desk gathering what slivers of evidence he could. A receipt noting a payment to a Dr. Ernesto Villalobos, a letter from a nursing agency with a stamped address for Santa Lucia, the rosary between his fingers, its beads cool. The rain's percussion on the window joined with the piano's old chord in his ear. Memory and present fused until he could no longer tell where he ended and the house's obligation began. He told himself he would ask questions, quietly, starting with the banal courtesies of a son who wanted to be thorough. He called the number for the clinic listed in the nursing agency letter as if placing an appointment for a maintenance meeting. A polite receptionist answered, offering a practiced calm that offices sell with the efficiency of their telephone scripts. The voice would not confirm anything so bluntly. It offered, when pushed, a sentence that could be read as both solace and obstruction. "We can search the file, but if the records are older than 5 years, they may be archived." Hector found himself thinking about archives in the way one thinks of locked chests. There are usually 2 ways things are kept from you: legal forms and people who have learned to look away. He did not yet know how wide the forgetting had been, or whether it had been deliberate. He only knew that Dolores had touched the portrait as if a living person still inhabited its frame, and the rosary sank weightily into his palm like a pebble opening a dam. Jimena watched him probe, her expression a mixture of annoyance and calculation. Something in her posture shifted subtly when he began to visit the archive more often. She had enough savvy to know that questions have a way of becoming public when the wealthy ask them. The family's reputations floated on a shallow pool of meticulous presentation, and waves were not welcome. "Leave the past alone," she said once, when Hector confronted her with a folded receipt he had found in an old ledger. Her tone was conversational, but it contained a steel hinge. "This is not the past," Hector answered. "This is my mother." Jimena's glance flickered to the portrait. In that instant, the woman in paint seemed to look more than at the room. She looked through people. Jimena had been clever, always. In public, she had been the natural steward of their standing. She could afford the moral illusions required for that job. That convenience sometimes is mercy, that choice is neat, that problems, when pressed, have a tidy perimeter. But a rosary in a janitor's hand refused tidy. When a man like Hector begins to pull on a thread, the fabric of an entire household shivers. The Montiel house had been careful with its seams. Records were typed and countersigned, funeral arrangements were organized before the family had finished sorting their grief, as if foreclosing on chaos. And yet some things had slipped. The hurried closing of a casket, the sealed lid that seemed to hold a weight not entirely consistent with the memory Hector had of his mother's hand. These were small sensations at first, an intimation more than an indictment, but they formed the kind of friction that wears down certainty. Dolores pressed another detail into Hector's hand, a small creased napkin on which a nurse had once written a room number and a name, Olivia. The name of a nurse, she said, who had been kind and who kept a copy of a note, who had once told Dolores that paperwork moves differently when someone is inconvenient. Olivia was a whisper of a person in Dolores's recollection, humble, worried, the kind of nursing professionals small systems both rely on and soothe with borrowed compassion. "He kept a list," Dolores said once as she polished the piano's wood with a rag, a ritual of cleaning and of ordering the air around them. "Names of people who would be easier to move. He said, Villalobos, he said it was for their own good." The name Villalobos made Hector feel physically colder. He remembered the doctor from his mother's last weeks, polished, efficient, the kind of man who wrote in smooth, authoritative ink. A psychiatrist with credentials. He had signed forms and filled reports, and there had been a meeting where people in suits nodded as Villalobos spoke of safety and care. There is a special kind of trust society grants to professionals. Credentials, a kind of armor against messy human conflict. If that trust is bought or twisted, the betrayal is sharper than any other. Hector kept his acts of searching small at first, copying a receipt here, memorizing a ledger entry there. He had no appetite for immediate publicity. He understood the danger of unmoored accusations, but he also understood the longer pain of not knowing. The house's architecture of grief had been arranged in such a way that anyone pressing too hard seemed at the very least ungrateful. At worst, they threatened the family's image. Hector had never been good at managing images. He had been good at bearing the weight of decisions and at pretending that bearing was its own form of absolution. He found one document by accident. It was an envelope slipped behind a stack of business cards, the kind of thing a housekeeper might misplace and then recycle into the yawning dark behind drawers. The envelope bore a faint stamp and a curve of ink he recognized. There was a transfer slip inside, the kind of small administrative thing that facilities produce when moving someone from one place to another. The ink was older than recent record-keeping, the edges were browned slightly, but a name was penciled in a hand he too well knew, Jimena's signature, abbreviated to a practiced flourish. Hector sat down as if the envelope had the power to push him into the chair. He had expected to find money transfers to the clinic. He had not expected the simple, terrible clean line of a transfer slip. a paper that prosaically recorded that someone had been moved somewhere. He read the shorthand they used for locations until his eye landed on a word written in a cramped hand by someone else. Santa Lucia, room 217. The piano's silent chord seemed to answer. Rain tapped like nails. Memory and evidence formed a shape he could not ignore. A woman who had been declared dead. A funeral which the family had attended as if the past were closed. Transfers and signatures that suggested a decision had not been accidental, but administratively neat. Hector thought of the coffin. He had not wanted to obsess over the stupid little details. Weight, sound, the woods give. But the world of power is made of moments, and one such moment had lodged in his head. The way the lid of the casket had felt slightly too light when the pallbearer's shoulder rose and fell. The recollection was small, ridiculous, something you might write off as the trick of grief. But grief makes tricks possible. The seed of doubt, once fallen into the soil of a household's record-keeping, grows. He kept the envelope in his pocket. He did not tell Jimena what he had found. He only sat in front of the portrait one night and watched the painted eyes for a long time. In the painting, Doña Josefa's gaze had the kind of even mercy that lives on canvas. She looked like someone who had been photographed whole and comfortable. The portrait, against the shadows of the room, became an accusation of sorts, its stillness pressing against the house's nervous activity. Hector touched the rosary Dolores had given him and felt the bead's smoothness against his palm as if they might be used as a key. The signs accumulated like small tributaries into a river heading somewhere inevitable. Hector wanted to be cautious because he had learned that rushing to judgment was as harmful as doing nothing. He wanted to speak to a lawyer, to look at the official death certificate and see whether it bore the hallmarks of a regular course of events. But the house moved him differently. Time there was elastic, and the pace of revelation could be slow as a letter arriving by post. One evening, after an argument with Jimena about a luncheon scheduled in Doña Josefa's name, Hector found his patience running thin. He thought of the way Dolores had said, "She asked about her picture." He thought of the rosary and the transfer slip. The rain had stopped, and the house smelled like wet stone. He opened an old bureau, the kind with a false bottom that had been used to keep stock certificates and, once, years before, his father's will. He nearly laughed at his own melodrama when his hand brushed paper and metal. There were, stacked carefully and annotated in his father's handwriting, copies of hospital bills and a folded note. It was half a miraculous find and half the most ordinary thing in the world. Bureaucracy leaves crumbs. In the folder, in a corner he might have missed, he found an invoice without the usual business seal. It looked as if someone had printed it and then tried to erase a name. The paper smelt faintly of disinfectant and lemon. The type read like a clinical ledger: dates, services, transfers. And in a corner, as if afterthought, someone had typed, "Trans, Santa Lucia, 217. Hector felt the room tilt. He had not yet accused anyone aloud. He had not yet allowed the words to form a sentence in which his wife's name was the executor of a choice that might have been cruel. He took the paper to Dolores, who was sweeping the music room's rug with gentle, precise strokes. The rosary lay beside her lunch tin, casual when small, the crucifix pointed toward the piano. When she saw the paper, she did not smile. She merely nodded, the expression one reserves for confirmation rather than triumph. "They said she would be safer," Dolores murmured. "They said it would be better for her. But she asked me about the piano, Hector. She asked me if she would hear you play." The question landed between them like a shard of glass. Hector had never been a man given to stylings of sorrow. Tears came to him as acts of surrender, and he had not been ready to surrender to the degree this discovery required. His guilt, which had been an abstract ache, now had a body: signatures, receipts, a rosary. The world of denial in which he had huddled was crumbling. At the same moment, he felt the growing, childish impulse to strike back. He imagined confronting Jimena on the marble steps, making her answer in the public way that would make the story clean. But he was not a man who wanted spectacle. He wanted the truth. He wanted, more than anything perhaps, to hear his mother's voice again, and to know if she had been silenced in a way the family's courtesy could not accept. So he did the practical thing that all men in his position are tempted to do. He called someone outside the household to walk with his doubt. He would not yet involve the police. Those matters demanded caution. So he looked for someone who understood the world of documents and the way systems hide things. In the end, he found the right number through a friend of a friend. Ricardo Salgado, a private investigator with a reputation for discretion and a bias toward justice. Ricardo's practice was the kind that operated in the quiet hours when the official channels are cautious. He was a small man, quick with an observation and lethal with patience. When they met, Hector did not speak in the melodramatic language of betrayal. He placed the envelope on Ricardo's desk and watched the investigator pick it up as if it were exactly the sort of thing he had been waiting for, small proof of larger structures. Ricardo read, nodded, and folded the paper into a manila folder with fingers that suggested a familiarity with both bureaucratic oddities and human failure. "This is enough to start," Ricardo said, "not to arrest anyone tonight, but to ask questions at the right places." Hector felt the precariousness of the word start like a promise and a threat. He had never known until that moment how much of his life had been compartmentalized into neat areas that his family had deemed private. He had not known that his role in preserving the family's outward calm had been in some ways a form of collusion, passive, complex, and painful. He had not known either how small witnesses, people like Dolores, find the courage to name what they had seen. When they met, Hector did not speak in the melodramatic language of betrayal. He placed the envelope on Ricardo's desk and watched the investigator pick it up, as if it were exactly the sort of thing he had been waiting for, small proof of larger structures. Ricardo read, nodded, and folded the paper into a manila folder with fingers that suggested a familiarity with both bureaucratic oddities and human failure. "This is enough to start," Ricardo said, "not to arrest anyone tonight, but to ask questions at the right places." Hector felt the precariousness of the word start like a promise and a threat. He had never known, until that moment, how much of his life had been compartmentalized into neat areas that his family had deemed private. He had not known either how small witnesses, people like Dolores, find the courage to name what they had seen. Before the meeting with Ricardo, Hector had tried to think of Jimena in simpler terms, as an efficient steward of family fortune, as someone who navigated the world of high society with the grace he sometimes envied. But the documents made it harder to keep the fantasy of neatness. If his wife had signed the transfers or authorized payments, what had been her motive? He did not want to imagine her as malicious. He wanted to think of her as frightened, as someone who believed hard choices could keep them afloat. But he could not ignore the possibility that convenience had been mistaken for mercy. That night, Hector played a single chord on the piano, the note ironed into the instrument's memory, and let it ring. The sound felt like a plea. Doña Josefa had loved music. The house had learned to associate the instrument with both beauty and grief. The chord hung and then faded, a small punctuation. Meanwhile, Dolores resumed her routine of sweeping and whispering prayers under her breath. The rosary was folded carefully into her blouse when she knelt in corners to scrub. She did not ask for credit. The truth was, she said later to a friend on the bus line, that the rosary was the only tangible thing she could return if the world turned out to be made of lies. "I keep the beads," she told the friend, "because if I have them, I can say I did not forget." The days that followed were a series of small tiles set into a mosaic. Actor requested copies of the funeral home's contracts and found an invoice that lacked the usual description of services. It was as if someone had left out details so a question could be denied later. He called a clerk at the records office, who, after being polite and then unhelpful, finally said they would pull the death certificate for review. The language the clerk used was neutral, but the cadence of her answers suggested the kind of institutional habit that knows when a caller is nervous and when a caller is simply curious. As Hector gathered the paperwork, Jimena hovered in the corners of his life like an exhalation. She did not deny his right to look, she merely suggested that the house needed protection. "If there is an error, it will be resolved," she said, offering half-truth as balm. "If there is a misunderstanding, we will correct the record." Her face had the gentle cruelty of a person who had learned to arrange reality like a set. Hector did not know if she thought she was doing the right thing, or if she had been frightened into choices that now seemed monstrous. Both possibilities hurt. He prayed quietly in the nights, sometimes aloud, sometimes not. His mother's rosary was the only object that gave his prayers a shape. He prayed for a clarity he had not earned, and, perhaps, for an absolution that would not come. One afternoon, when the sky was as heavy as the weight of decisions, an envelope arrived at the Montiel house, addressed to Hector. The handwriting was small, and someone had used careful ink. Inside, there was a photograph. Doña Josefa in a wheelchair by a window, the light washed through and soft, a blanket over her knees, a rosary in her fingers. Someone had written on the back, "Room 217, Santa Lucia." The photograph looked like a stolen mercy. It was, to Hector, both a confirmation and a summons. He felt the world narrow. Jimena's expression that evening was unreadable. She met his eyes and did not offer the solace he had once expected in those small domestic crises. In the kitchen, he opened the photograph with hands that trembled not from age, but from something purer. Anticipation, fear, the love of a son who suddenly had to be brave in a way he had avoided his whole life. When he told Jimena and Dolores that he would go to Santa Lucia to ask for the file, the room changed. Jimena's jaw tightened in a way that made him see her differently, not just as his wife, but as someone with stakes to protect. "If you go, you should not make accusations without proof," she warned. Her voice was cool, suggestive of counsel and of a woman accustomed to mitigation. "I will ask questions," Hector said. He did not say that asking questions could tear open something he might not want revealed. He did not say that he had already begun to suspect that his mother's absence had been administratively manufactured and emotionally rationalized in ways that were hard to undo. The narrative threads were beginning to tighten like lines on a violin. In their intersections lay a human anatomy of betrayal, secrecy, the small kindness that becomes smothering, professional authority potentially abused, and the quiet courage of those who did not belong in the house's usual narratives. The picture of Doña Josefa with a rosary in her hand was not an indictment so much as a hinge, something that might swing the house's history into the light. By the time Hector shut the study's door, the room smelled like rain and old paper. He placed the photograph where the painted portrait could not ignore it, on the piano's top, beside the program from the memorial service, as if daring the two images to be reconciled. The last light of day lay across the keys like proof that some instruments still answered when touched. Outside, in the alleyway where the staff took their smokes and their whispered breaks, Dolores sat alone on a crate, peeling the paint with the back of her thumbnail. A woman from the household staff walked past, nodded, and murmured about the weather. The city was indifferent to the tremors of a single family. It had its own history of people lost to convenience and power, of neat little covers over inconvenient truth. Dolores looked down at the rosary tucked in her palm. It was an anchor and a hazard. If she told more than she already had, she risked the kind of retribution people like her too often experience when they name the things the powerful want to forget. But she had already crossed the threshold. She had placed the rosary where an heir might see it. She had done what she could. Hector slept poorly that night. The house, always a creature of night and muted lamps, seemed to close tighter when secrets gathered. He dreamed of the casket hinged too light, and of a woman humming a hymn in a room that smelled of lemon and antiseptic. He woke with an old shame in his throat and rehearsed the words he would say at Santa Lucia. He would be careful. He would not make a spectacle. He would ask for records. He would ask to see who signed on what dates. He would act like a son with a simple need, nothing more, nothing theatrical. Yet even as he rehearsed the script of the cautious investigator, an image would intrude. His mother's hand on the piano, the slight tilt of her head when she listened to music, the way a rosary might be passed into another person's palm, heavy with trust. He had always thought trust easy when handed to people you love. Now he realized it had seams that could be forced. The next morning, Hector left the estate with an envelope in his pocket, the photograph of Doña Josefa tucked inside. Dolores watched him go from the back door, as if seeing a vessel set out to sea. Jimena watched from the parlor, her reflection in the window untroubled yet somehow brittle. The rain began again, not like a sheet, but in the slow insistence of a city that remembers everything eventually. The house watched them leave. The portrait watched them go. When Hector arrived at Santa Lucia, the facade looked nothing like the saintly name suggested. It was institutional in the way many such places are. Neat hedges, a circular drive, windows with curtains that were thick enough to keep the interior private. The reception desk had the flat smile of bureaucracy. An assistant took his name and wrote it in a ledger. The letters looked as if they had been waiting for his arrival. He felt oddly small, as if the building's thoroughness had been constructed to swallow questions. He asked simply for records, for the file of Doña Josefa Montiel. The assistant consulted a computer and then spoke in the neutral tones of a clerk who has learned the art of non-committal hospitality. Hector watched her expression carefully. She typed, then paused, and said she would need authorization. Authorization. The word was a gate, a polite refusal dressed as procedure. Hector handed her the photograph he had been given. It was a small, tactical maneuver, a human face attached to a name. The clerk softened. "We have a policy," she said, "without a power of attorney or legal representation." Hector interrupted, because some things in life grate against bureaucracy with the force of common decency. "She is my mother," he said simply. "I have reason to believe." "Sir," the clerk said, tone returning to neutral, "if you provide identification and fill out this release, we can check whether she's under our care." Hector filled the form, moved as if underwater. He signed his name, the letters wobbling with a truth he had been denying. He waited in a room that smelled faintly of lemon and the bleach that hospitals use to suggest sterility. There were other people there, in various states of attention and neglect. A woman knitting, a man reading a thin magazine. No one looked at him in a way that suggested his arrival was anything other than one more item on a ledger. The clerk returned with a name locked into a database and a firm voice. "We have no record under Doña Josefa Montiel with your date of birth." She said it as if facts were stable and unyielding. Hector felt the floor drop out. He reached for the photograph like a talisman. "She was here," he said. "There's a room number, 217. Someone says she was here within the last year." The clerk's expression changed in the way someone's face changes when they have been trained to keep limits but cannot help the human softness of curiosity. "Room 217 is archived," she began, then added with a caution that suggested more than mere policy, "but if you have authorization, we can search the paper files." Hector thought of the receipt and the transfer slip, of Jimena's signature, the rosary now warm in his pocket. He thought of Dolores's hands and of flowers left at a grave he now questioned. He felt like someone stepping into a dark room with a candle whose flame might flicker out at any moment. They agreed to search the paper files. The clerk left to find them, and Hector sat as if waiting for a verdict. The building's muffled hum turned into a slow, patient shuffling of paper and the soft clack of a metal filing cabinet being opened. The clerk returned with a cardboard box the color of stale milk and set it on the counter as if placing a small animal down with care. Hector watched the clerk pull back the lid and draw out folders, each one thick with stamped dates, signatures, and the peculiar smell of institutional ink. The filing room hummed with fluorescence. Outside, a thin January light pressed against the glass. "Room 217, the clerk said, as if reading from a map. Her fingers sifted until finally she found a folder with a label in a slow, careful hand. When she handed it to him, it felt like a legal promise. He opened it and at first saw only neat medical forms and checklists. But then his eye caught a familiar flourish, a shorthand authorization. The signature looked like a practiced loop, Jimena's signature, abbreviated again and again in small authorizations stamped with times and dates. Hector's face must have changed because the clerk's expression softened. "There are privacy laws," she murmured, "but we can photocopy internal notes for family members with proof of kinship. The file is not complete in the computer because it was archived." By the time Hector left Santa Lucia, the sky had gone from lead to a paler, indecisive blue. He carried photocopies in a clear folder like a makeshift talisman. The rosary was heavy in his coat pocket, the beads clicking against the paper with each step. The photograph of Doña Josefa he had placed on the piano now felt less like a supplication and more like a summons. He thought of the funeral altar and of the hush of the congregation and how quickly condolence had been folded into duty. When he returned to the estate, Ricardo Salgado was waiting in the driveway under a canopy of wet magnolia leaves. The detective's face held the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to listen for the pause that comes before the truth arrives. Hector handed him the photocopies with hands that betrayed a tremor. Ricardo read with the skepticism of his trade, then with the small, steady anger of a person who recognizes pattern. "There's enough here to demand answers," he said. "Not to accuse, but to question formally. Transfers, authorizations, notes about medication that looks routine on paper but raises questions when combined with a timeline." They began to piece together the chronology in the study, the grand piano watching like an old judge. Dolores moved through the house as if she belonged to its small, necessary operations. She brought tea in a chipped mug and sat with Hector in the half-light while he read aloud the lines Ricardo underlined. Dates of transfer, the intervals between payments, an entry about a comfort plan that had unusually high charges. "These documents show a pattern," Ricardo said quietly. "They're not proof of crime in themselves, paper seldom is. But whoever prepared these had a clear idea of what was to be done and when. The repeated use of the same signatures and the timing around family events is suspicious." Hector felt as if a new kind of light illuminated the house, one that rendered small, otherwise banal decisions into acts with consequences. He turned a page and found an entry about a palliative regimen with a notation signed by Dr. Ernesto Villalobos. The doctor's name always had a neat serif in the Montiel ledger, a mark of professional authority. Now it felt like an emblem. "Call Olivia," Dolores said suddenly, as if the idea had been waiting in her thought like a seed. "She kept a list. She said when paperwork moves like that, someone protects it. She wrote on a napkin once and gave it to me." Olivia was a name Hector carried like a faint song he could not place until Dolores pressed a folded napkin into his palm. The note had been written in a hurried, slanted script. "Olivia, RN, remembers. Room 217, ask for me." No number, no address, only the quick scrawl of someone nervous and trying to transmit a memory. Ricardo smiled at the smallness of it.
the way a scrap of paper could be a map. They did not go to the press. Ricardo's advice was surgical and disciplined. Gather evidence, secure testimony, document a chain. He had an investigator's moral calculus.
Public accusations could be harmful without corroboration. They could also create danger. "We'll get Olivia's statement," he said. "We'll ask for any internal memos mentioning transfers. And we'll ask the bank for records showing payments, legally, through the right channels." That night, when Hector closed the study door and the house settled as if in anticipation, he played a line on the piano that his mother had loved. The note hung, and for a moment the entire instrument seemed to lean toward him in recognition. He thought of visits left brief and practical, of afternoons he had chosen to be elsewhere, of the small acts of omission that had, when compiled, the weight of active forgetting. The sight of Jimena's signature rerouted the geometry of his private history. It was not only debts and assets she had managed. She had been an architect of a decision that affected someone's life. Dolores returned to work the next day with the quiet resolve of someone who had decided to stand within danger rather than beside it. At the clinic's periphery, Olivia proved harder to summon than a name on a napkin. Ricardo's network, however, rearranged the world as it needed to be rearranged. A nurse who had once worked at Santa Lucia and moved on, a current employee with a conscience willing to trade anonymity for safety, a messenger who would place a note in the right hands. Olivia arrived at the Montiel estate one afternoon with the kind of resolution that had been tempered by fear. She had dirt under her fingernails and a gentle, guarded way of speaking. She sat in the music room with the photograph of Doña Josefa between her hands, and with nothing theatrical in her voice, told Hector what she had seen. "I wrote things down because I was scared they would not be heard," Olivia said. "We had orders from Dr. Villalobos sometimes. He placed people on lists because they were difficult in family homes. Some relatives wanted rest, and the clinic agreed. But some notes did not sit right. Medication given in ways I would not expect. Transfers recorded that did not match patient conditions. Once, an order came in that a family member had requested hospice, but the person still spoke clearly in the mornings." She paused as if tasting the air for danger. "I kept copies sometimes, not to defy anyone, but to remember. Paper is sometimes the only thing that remembers what people want to forget." Hector watched Olivia's hands as she spoke. They folded and unfolded like someone practicing the choreography of confession. She had a file in her bag, and she slid it across the piano lacquer to Hector. Inside were photocopies of notes, an internal memo with Villalobos' stamp, and a small receipt, one of the kind Hector had found in the drawer, showing a payment with Jimena's family account. The room felt small and enormous at once. The piano ceiling seemed to lower until the portrait watched like a juror. Hector tried to believe in nuance, that Jimena had acted from fear or misinformed counsel, that Villalobos might have convinced a well-meaning family that institutional care was the safest route. But then the receipts and the patterns became contours of intent. Payments were oddly timed, signatures repeated, and the quiet note about the coffin being sealed in a hurry came with no satisfactory explanation. When they confronted their first hard fact, the sealed coffin, Hector had to remember the evening of the funeral with painful detail. He remembered the slight give in the wood and the pallbearer's swift steps. The idea of an empty coffin began no longer as a sensational image, but as a procedural question. Why had the casket been sealed so quickly? For whom? And based on what documentation? He asked Olivia if she had ever seen similar cases. "Yes," she said. "When families are embarrassed or frightened, they ask clinics to manage things without too much paperwork. It makes trouble less visible. The paperwork becomes a tool to close things down. In a way, it looks neat. That can be convenient for people who want a clean end." Ricardo suggested they request bank statements formally. They filed a series of inquiries with the Montiel's bank, properly through counsel, to avoid tipping off whoever might be responsible. When the bank returned a traceable sequence of transfers to clinics and a pattern of recurring payments tied to 2 private accounts managed by a foundation Jimena administered, the arithmetic made the suspicion harder to neutralize with charity. They went to Villalobos next, not as a lynch mob, but as people seeking answers. Hector found himself at the doctor's office with Dolores at his side, and Ricardo standing unobtrusively nearby. Villalobos' waiting room smelled faintly of citrus and authority. The doctor greeted them with an easy smile that had been practiced in public relations guides. In front of the framed certificates, he looked like a man who had never had reasons to look guilty. "Dr. Villalobos," Hector began, holding the photocopy of the transfer slip, "why is my mother's transfer recorded here? Why does her file show prolonged care and payments signed by Jimena?" Villalobos' face tightened. He read the document with professional interest, then with a flicker of something like irritation. "Mr. Montiel, we provide care and consult with families. If there were transfers, these are administrative matters. I cannot discuss patient specifics without proper authorization." Ricardo, meanwhile, had been listening for inflection. "There are patterns we need to understand," he said. "We have receipts, notes, a nurse's testimony that patients were moved and medications administered in ways that raise questions. If those decisions were taken in good faith, explain the paperwork. If not, we will proceed legally." Villalobos' shoulders stiffened, and his voice became the practiced tone of a man who had seen confrontations many times and survived them. "I advised what I believed was in the best interest of the patient," he said. "Families often opt for care outside the home because it can be safer. If there are allegations of misconduct, they should be taken to the appropriate authorities." His defensiveness was not denial so much as an attempt to reframe the debate. He emphasized clinical prerogative and the difficulty of speaking about patient care. He maintained a professional distance that doubled as deflection. Yet, in the notes Olivia had given them, and in the receipts Hector had found, there were signatures and transfers that suggested the clinical recommendations coincided too neatly with financial arrangements. "You told families to sign these authorizations?" Hector asked finally. "Did you ever suggest transferring someone against the family's wishes?" Villalobos paused. "I suggested when clinical indications existed, but I cannot answer hypotheticals. If you have questions about specific dates, speak to my office." The meeting ended without dramatic confession, but as they left Villalobos' polished building, Hector felt a keener edge to his grief. Confrontation had not yielded absolution. It had given him only a clearer outline of the resistance inside professional language. Olivia, however, offered what might be the most important piece of paper of all, a small folded note with the words "transfer completed" and a stamp that connected Santa Lucia to a funeral home. It was not a smoking gun in the sensational sense. It was a bureaucratic breadcrumb. Ricardo smiled the sort of smile that signaled progress. "We have a trail," he said. "It's time to use official channels. We'll bring this to a prosecutor and ask for an inquiry. It won't be instantaneous, but it will force institutions to open doors." The prosecutor moved with the measured gears of the public system. A warrant process unfolded in documents rather than drama. No cinematic chase, only legalese and signatures and a bureaucratic insistence on procedure. A search warrant requested a review of files at Santa Lucia and authorization to interview staff. The process was cautious. Hector feared delays and the comfort of inertia. But the law, too, can be a form of light. Slow, often cumbersome, but capable of opening locked rooms. On the appointed morning, a small team arrived at Santa Lucia with paperwork, police presence, and people wielding notebooks rather than torches. The clinic staff received them with varying degrees of composure.
The director, a woman in her 50s with a clipped haircut, insisted on the propriety of everything they did. Threatened with a judicial order, however, she produced loose, unstitched files and led the investigators through hallways whose carpets flattened under feet that had tried to silence history.
Hector walked behind the official procession like a man led by a cord. He kept his hands folded so they wouldn't tremble. He watched doors open, folders being taken and examined, rooms in which the air smelled of disinfectant and the faint, human reek of institutional living. They came to a wing that sat under a different kind of hush, the kind of hush that, in flat rooms, is made with sedatives and routine. They stopped at a door with a brass number, 217. When the door opened, the light fell in, not harsh but restrained. The room smelled faintly of lavender and bleach. And there, by the window, Doña Josefa sat in a chair that had been arranged to catch afternoon sun. She was thinner than the portrait suggested. Time had scraped her cheeks, but her eyes were open and they found Hector as if a line had remained between them. Her fingers held a rosary that trembled with the rhythm of a prayer that had not stopped. The scene was not cinematic in the way of a movie reveal. There was no filmic orchestral swell, only the sound of a breath finding its place. Hector's knees softened. He took a step forward, and Doña Josefa's lips moved with a voice that was smaller than memory but unmistakable. "Hector," she said, and in that single second the name was both a key and a confession. He crossed to her with the care of someone entering an old cathedral. He saw the thinness, the faded sleeve, the way the rosary wrapped like a ritual around her fingers. He touched her hand and felt the bones that had once animated a lifetime of commands and comforts. She looked at him as if she had been waiting for forgiveness or explanation. He could not tell which she required more. "Oh, hijo," she murmured, and that ordinary phrase did what forms could not. It unraveled years of careful reticence. The reunion was not loud. There were young nurses who watched, policemen who took notes, and Ricardo who stood close but silent. Olivia, who had come with Hector, wept quietly into a tissue. Dolores, who had traveled with them, held the rosary like someone meeting a prodigal object that had returned. "How did you find me?" Doña Josefa asked, in a voice that betrayed confusion and a surprising lucidity. "I waited sometimes for the music." Hector tried to ground his words in what mattered. He had rehearsed accusations, speeches, questions. None of them held up to the small terror of seeing his mother alive. "We had reasons to say," he said simply. "We were told you were gone." Doña Josefa seemed to weigh every syllable. "They told me many things," she said, "that I could not sleep and that it would be better for me to rest. They brought me here and there, and there were men who closed doors, but sometimes I knew the piano was far away." There was a long silence that belonged to a lifetime. Then a young investigator asked whether she had been given medications she had not needed, whether forms had been signed on her behalf. Her answers were halting, but contained a terrible clarity. She could recall being moved. She remembered faces and hymns. She remembered nothing of a funeral. The coffin at the cemetery, the photographs, those were things she had not seen. Legal officers recorded observations, and Olivia read aloud some internal notes that corroborated administrative choices made around the date of the supposed death. Dr. Villalobos was contacted and arrived, initially composed, then increasingly uncomfortable. In his statements, he attempted to frame moves as clinically necessary. In private, under probe, his timeline showed decisions authorized and executed. One crucial piece of evidence was a transfer form that bore Jimena's signature, an authorization for comfort transfer, with a note that read like bureaucratic euphemism. The signature itself was not criminal proof. Signatures can be obtained or signed with consent. But when the signatures were juxtaposed with the absence of family visits and the way the house had moved quickly into funeral arrangements, a picture emerged, one of choices made at a distance, executed within the pleasant language of care. Jimena arrived at the clinic during the hours when the investigatory team were still sorting through boxes. She had been reached by Ricardo and by someone on the Montiel legal staff. A car had deposited her at the clinic with an expression of resolve smoothed into composure. She stood at the doorway looking like someone who had been cast suddenly in a role for which she had rehearsed only for the appearance. "Hector," she said when she finally came into the room, voice controlled. Her eyes skimmed the scene. She saw her mother, and then the files, and then Dolores, and the detective standing near the window. "What is happening?" Hector felt everything in him sharpen. It was one of those moments that demand a decision between spectacle and substance. He had not come to vilify his wife on the floor of a hospital wing. He had come to retrieve a person and to force clarity. "You signed for transfers," he said, not as prosecutor but as a man who wanted to understand whether his marriage had accompanied moral choices he did not yet understand. "You authorized these transfers and payments. Why?" Jimena's face flickered like a disturbed reflection. For a moment she looked weary, as if a load she had been carrying had grown too heavy. She said finally, "We were told she was safer. She could be stressed by home life. I thought we were doing what was best." "Safer for whom?" Dolores asked, voice small but iron. "Because she remembered the piano. She remembered her granddaughter. She remembered the rosary." The exchange had an internal quality, more devastating than any raised voice. Two people trying, in different languages, to explain the same act. Jimena spoke of schedules, of financial strains, of the burden of being the woman who would inherit obligations she feared. Hector listened and felt a sorrow shaped like complicity. He had let his life be managed. He had not been present. Yet Jimena's motives, fear, ambition, convenience, sat like hot coals. He wanted to ransack them for villainy or for exculpation. Instead, he tried for something steadier, the truth. The clinic's director stepped in, insisting on procedures and explaining that the facility would cooperate with the probe. For all her professional language, however, there were parts of her explanation that sounded like a shield raised too quickly, a reiteration of policies and a claim that the patient's family had agreed to a care plan. When legal representatives arrived and the prosecutor began to indicate lines of inquiry, Villalobos's account began to fray. Under the quiet pressure of depositions, he admitted that he had acted on family recommendations and that some decisions had been influenced by financial negotiations. He insisted, however, that he believed they were in the patient's best medical interest. Whether that belief justified omission of family presence at key moments, at transfer, at a formal declaration of death, was a legal question, and the investigators left it in the hands of the authorities who would examine the records. The drama of culpability would, in time, take its own slow course. For now, the urgency was human rescue. Hector sat with his mother as she regained small measures of clarity. Her memory was not whole, but she remembered the smell of lemon oil and the notes of the piano. She remembered small things that proved continuity. An old hymn, the cadence of a lullaby. When he told her that the funeral had occurred, she laid her head back and said with a voice like a church bell, "They told me I had been somewhere else." Later, after the paperwork and the formal statements, in the car that carried them back to the house, Doña Josefa slept briefly with the rosary in her hand. Her face, in the dim light, held a fragile peace. Hector watched the lines that mapped the passage of years and felt a grief he had not allowed, for what she had lost in the thorough, clinical months away, and for the family that had failed in its basic duties. Jimena did not come home with them that evening. She remained at a friend's house, phone off for long stretches, sometimes answering with a hollow apology. The legal matters to be parsed required distance and advisors. Hector, however, had little appetite for strategy in the immediate hours. He wanted his mother in his house, near the portrait, with the piano tuned, with the rosary returned to its place. He wanted the ordinary rituals undone and repaired. Doña Josefa returned to the Montiel house with a small procession, Dolores at her side, Olivia holding an old blanket, Ricardo trailing with his folder, a lawyer with a respectful expression, and a few investigators ensuring the legal formalities. The house itself seemed to receive her as if it had been missing the note that completed its court. When she saw the portrait, she paused so long that the room held its breath. Then she reached out and touched the frame with a slow reverence. "It looks the same," she said, almost to herself, but not the same. At home, the first week was a measured scene of care rather than a dramatic coda. Doctors visited to reassess, social workers arrived to ensure that Doña Josefa would not be returned to ambiguity. The family took tentative steps back toward one another. Hector's guilt transpired into quiet acts. He sat on the porch with his mother every evening and played the piano a few notes. He listened when she named the old neighbors and the songs she loved. She forgave sometimes with a sharpness. At other times, she offered small mercies that were less about absolution and more about a weary acceptance of human failing. Publicly, the story spread in the ways such things do. Threads of rumor swelled into articles, commentators asked uncomfortable questions, and foundations hired spokespeople to manage reputations. Jimena's role provoked discussion, not only about her motives, but about the culture that allowed decisions to be privatized behind bureaucracy. There were no easy judgments. Even among those who criticized her, there were glances that admitted nuance, fear, social pressure, the desire to keep belonging. Jimena withdrew from public life for a time. No one staged a melodramatic exile, rather she took a step away, to be present to the legal process and later to an attempted private reconciliation. The authorities took statements and examined public and private records. There were inquiries into processes at Santa Lucia, and the prosecutor opened an investigation into administrative practices. Villalobos faced a professional review. Whether criminal charges would be filed would depend on a slow legal calculus. Ricardo, patient as a locksmith, continued to work the edges of the case, ensuring that the chain of documents was preserved and that witnesses, like Olivia, were supported. In the months that followed, the household transformed itself into an instrument of repair. They did not dramatize the change, they organized it with the practical energy of people who knew that the public drama would fade more quickly than the personal work required to restore trust. Doña Josefa's days filled with small routines. A walk in the garden, a weekly hour at the piano where Hector practiced and sometimes failed under her watchful eye. Afternoons with Sophia, her granddaughter, who brought comic books and the uncalculated warmth of youth. Dolores sat often at the back of the music room during those hours, a silent sentinel who had, by that point, become family in a way that blurred employment and kinship. They did not leap immediately to forgiveness as a platitude. Hector and Jimena, when they attempted reconciliation, did so in the strange, clinical way of two adults who had been welded into shared histories. Their conversations were awkward, honest in parts, evasive in others. Jimena spoke of fear and of the pressure to preserve an image that she believed kept her family safe. Hector spoke of absence and the ways he had rationalized non-involvement. They argued, they sat in silence, and sometimes they cried like people who had been surprised by the weight of their own choices. Doña Josefa, for her part, offered a steady gravity. She had been mistreated by omission. She had been denied small acts of choice. Her response to those who had acted, if there were any public consequences, was measured. "I am here," she told them in a voice that suggested resignation more than triumph, "and there are many who need help to come home." This attitude, the refusal of vengeance, shaped the Montiel's next steps. Out of the shame and the revelation,
Hector and Doña Josefa, with the counsel of Ricardo and the humble insistence of Dolores and Olivia, decided to found a small trust, a foundation dedicated to helping the elderly and vulnerable find dignity and care, to offer legal help for families doubting institutional decisions, and to fund oversight for small facilities. It was, in part, an act of atonement and, in part, a structural attempt to make sure other families would not find their elders erased within paperwork. The foundation did not erase the past. It functioned as a way to channel remorse into institution building. Inauguration was quiet. A modest plaque, a piano recital in a charity hall, and smiles that had the melancholy of fresh repair. The piano motif returned, this time as music played not only to memory, but to hope. Sophia, who had been small and insistent in the months prior, performed a clumsy but earnest piece that made Doña Josefa laugh in a way Hector had not heard in years. Jimena, months later, attended the foundation's opening with a composed face and a pair of hands that betrayed nerves. She gave a short speech, not seeking absolution, but acknowledging the damage done and the need to repair. Her voice did not seek to excuse. Rather, it attempted explanation. She would later step down from some of her public duties to work quietly on the foundation's management, learning to translate the motives that once led her to make urgent decisions into mechanisms of accountability. Legal consequences unfolded slowly and with the juridical patience such matters demand. The prosecutor's office issued fines and administrative penalties for irregularities at Santa Lucia. Villalobos faced censure and probations. Some staff were disciplined, others cooperated with reforms.
Criminal charges were contemplated, but required evidence of willful criminal conduct. The cases that involved negligence, administrative concealment, and abuse of authority occupied a legal gray that took time to resolve. The Montiels, especially Hector, remained realistic. They wanted accountability that would protect others, not theatrical punishment. The emotional resolution was quieter. Hector learned to inhabit a different kind of sonship, one that involved being present without grand apologies, listening without needing to be absolved immediately. He cooked Sunday meals, accompanied his mother to small civic events, and sat at the piano more often than before. Doña Josefa, who had been both the matriarch and the moral compass, became an advocate from her porch and a presence at the foundation's board meetings, where her voice was calm and unhurried. Dolores received a job offer that changed the shape of her life, a managerial role in the foundation's outreach team that allowed her to work formally on behalf of the elderly in the city. She accepted with a modest pride, the kind that comes from moving a needle in a system resistant to movement. Olivia continued nursing, but did so with the support of a program that protected whistleblowers in care environments. Ricardo, who had done his best to keep the arc of the investigation lawful and humane, took his fee and returned to cases that required his stoic attention. Small victories multiplied into durable changes, improved documentation at facilities, a hotline for relatives, and audits. Time, which had once flattened memory, began to layer it differently. At the estate, the portrait reclaimed its place above the piano, no longer a mute symbol of the past, but a witness to a painful lesson. The frame was cleaned, the dust removed, in an act that felt almost ceremonial. Doña Josefa sat often beneath it, rosary in hand, as if to make sure that the portrait and the living woman saw one another fully. Rain still came, it still cleaned. The piano's tuning moved from somber intervals to more consonant phrases. Music became a way to stitch a family that had unraveled. In the final scene, months later, at the Foundation's small cultural center, a garden party gathered soft claps under a sky that had learned to be kind. A modest plaque bore Doña Josefa's name. 3 generations sat near the piano. Hector's fingers hovered over the keys and then began to play. The melody unfolded like a conversation, sometimes hesitant, sometimes firm, sometimes spilling into laughter when Sophia missed a note and the room rewarded her with easy applause. Dolores stood off stage, the rosary sometimes wrapped into her palm out of old habit. Olivia applauded from the second row, her cheeks still reddened by the memory of risk. Jimena sat quietly, her hands folded, a person learning the mechanics of penance and the work of care. Doña Josefa's eyes glinted. There was gratitude, but also a gravity that felt like resilience. When the music ended, the applause rose like small waves. It was not triumph. It was a communal breath. The sound neighbors, staff, family, and friends made when a house stops holding its breath. After the celebration, they returned to the music room. The portrait hung above the piano as it always had, and Doña Josefa reached up to touch its gilded edge like a blessing rather than a claim. Hector placed the rosary on the piano, and Dolores watched with a quiet, almost private satisfaction. "Thank you," Doña Josefa said, addressing the small circle that had gathered, "for remembering." Hector answered not with oratory, but with the small, sufficient truth of someone who had been remade by the work of listening. "We will remember," he said. "We will make sure other people don't fall through the gaps we found." They did not imagine the future as a blank slate. They understood the work ahead: legal battles, institutional reforms, and the slow bureaucracy of cultural change. But they also understood that small witnesses could chain together into movements, and that those movements begin with a story told in a modest voice. The janitor who had broken the silence, Dolores, continued to come by the estate. No longer anonymous, she occupied a place of acknowledged dignity. In the evenings, she would sit and listen as Hector practiced scales, sometimes humming along as his mother tapped the rhythm. The portrait watched, the rosary lay warm, and the house filled with music that was not always perfect but was honest. Memory, they had learned, was not only a retrieval, but an active work: attention, listening, the writing of proper records, and the insistence that a person's life not be folded into administrative convenience. If there was a moral, it was not a sermon. It was a fact of human maintenance. Truth, when named by the smallest among us, can unsettle the largest structures. The janitor's gaze at a painted face had been the first thin crack through which light entered. From that small act, an apron, a rosary, a confession, had come a sequence of steps that restored a voice, reconfigured a family's life, and moved a community to act. As the years advanced, the foundation funded legal aid for families, trained staff in ethical transfer practices, and supported hotlines where anxious relatives could check on a loved one's status. The Montiels learned to bear the memory of guilt with action rather than silence. They recognized that the portrait above the piano would never erase the months that had been stolen, but it could stand as a reminder of vigilance, of the dignity owed to the elderly, and of the strange, stubborn bravery of those who sweep floors and whisper the truths the powerful prefer to forget. On quiet nights, Hector would play the piano until the notes softened, sometimes with his mother humming close by, the rosary looping through her fingers. When the rain came, it would fall in the old way, soft, cleansing, impartial. The house listened. The portrait, too, had a new kind of tenderness. It no longer presided purely over history, but kept watch over a family learning to be awake. If someone asked years later what had made the difference, Hector might have answered with the simplest thing: a woman with an apron who dared to be seen in front of a painting, and who, with a rosary in her hand, refused to let a life be written away. The rest, the legal work, the investigations, the foundations, followed because someone had decided to say plainly, "She was alive. I saw her."